Dear students, today we are going to discuss characteristic of Alfred Lord Tennyson poetry. The Victorian age is also known as the age of Alfred Lord Tennyson. Hence, characteristics that support the Victorian age are there in his poetry. One of the best reasons which built the personality of Tennyson as a poet was his dramatic monologues. In the Victorian era, there was much development in every field of life, mainly in music, art, and literature. Poetry that was written in that era rejected that idea of romanticism. It became highly philosophical. Therefore, most of the poetry represent philosophical ideas. In his poetry, Lord Tennyson talks about the past, especially about the Greeks. Therefore, there is a rebirth of Greek myths in his poems. He writes intellectual poems with modern philosophy along with a blend of philosophical ideas. So now we'll discuss in detail the characteristic of Lord Tennyson poetry. So first of all, there is realism. On the second, there is naturalism. On the third, glory of past. The next one is philosophical ideas, and the fifth one is intellectualism, and the last one is modernism. So first of all, we'll discuss realism. Every writer, as Aristotle says in his book, poetics imitates life. Hence, poetry is reflection of life. However, it doesn't mean that every poet represents reality. Some poets highly exaggerate things when they present an idea. Romantic poets highly focus on imagination and exaggeration. For instance, John Keats and Coleridge are two famous romantic poets who tremendously talk about nature and overstate the incidents in his love poetry. John Keats always goes beyond the limitations. Similarly, Coleridge also talks about the supernatural elements. Hence, it is not necessary that every poet writes a poetry on the basis of reality. So it is the chief characteristic of Alfred Lord Tennyson poetry that he sticks to realism. He paints reality. Therefore, it is safe to say that he never told a lie. He tries to portray everyday life in the way we see it. He puts the submission in front of his readers as he sees it, and his readers feel the same. Every character, each place, and all the events in the poetry of Alfred Lord Tennyson are realistic and best describes him as a Victorian poet and thus adds realism in the list of characteristics of poetry. So the next one is naturalism. Elaborating nature in poetry does not necessarily make a poet romantic. Romantic poetry is all about passions and emotions, and it touches the sense as obvious from the poetry of John Keats. Naturalism in poetry, on the other hand, is all about extreme realistic picture of everyday society. Realism means to talk about realistic problems and not the imaginary ones, but naturalism means to portray at most realistic images. When a poet writes poetry based on naturalism, he keeps in mind the external sources that may influence a specific situation. In other words, the environment is the key factor in naturalism. Lord Alfred Tennyson is highly experienced in presentation of such realistic images. He focuses on presenting an utterly realistic environment. Every poem of his this poet is evident that he never goes beyond the external circumstances. Every situation, each incident, and all elaboration in his poems depicts natural elements. Hence, naturalism becomes among us the greatest characteristic of Alfred Lord Tennyson poetry. So the third one is glory of past. The Greek past is famous for heroic figures. Mostly the poets use allusions from Greek poems, especially from Homer's Iliad. In the same way, Tennyson also likes to talk about the past. One of the best poems of Alfred Tennyson that is worth mentioning here is Ulysses. In this famous dramatic monologue, he talks about the Greek hero as well as explorer Ulysses. It seems that he wants to let us know that the past was full of glorious victories. His reader must have knowledge about the famous event from the past as he uses far fetched allusions. Past has much importance in the eyes of Alfred Lord Tennyson, and he has a soft spot to discuss in his poetry, which glory of past should also be added in the list of characteristic of his poetry. So the next one is philosophical ideas. The poet that does poetry for the sake of poetry never talks about the philosophical ideas. It is not wrong to say that romantic poets consider to sin to discuss philosophy in their poems. Tennyson broke the convention. His poetry is full of revolutionary ideas. He motivates his reader and teaches them philosophy of life. He also gives moral lesson to readers. Therefore, his poetry is not only for the purpose of pleasure but also for the purpose of learning. There is no denying that fact that he is a good teacher and also a great reformer. He portrays theme based on philosophy. Thus, critics rightly says that Alfred Tennyson, as a philosophical poet who explored the field of philosophy while portraying philosophical ideas through his style, metaphors, allusions, symbol, and poetic devices, due to which representation of philosophical ideas is also another major characteristic of poetry. So the next one is intellectualism. Poetry of the great Victorian poetry is based on reasons. There is logic in his poetry. He never portrays a utopian world, nor does he try to add extraordinary supernatural element. He presents philosophy and realistic ideas. Therefore, there is no chance of leaving intellectualism behind. As mentioned earlier, Victorian age was the age of development. Therefore, reader highly interested in reading poetry that was based on reasoning. Intellectual poetry is against the norms of romantic poetry. It is because romantic poetry is full of patience and emotions, whereas intellectual poetry rejects emotion and feelings. It is the poetry of mind. People who are highly emotional seldom like the type of poetry. Lord Tennyson writes poetry of logic and reasoning. Hence, intellectualism and logic becomes the greatest characteristic of the poetry. So the last one is modernism. The poetry that contains all above mentioned element is called modern poetry. Like other ingredients, it also rejects the idea of romanticism. All above said salient feature best fit for modern poetry and Tennyson poems, though not completely yet near to modern poetry. Somehow, how does not remain mum on modern social problems and discusses them in one way or the other. Symbolic significance of every word in his poetry refers that modernism should not be excluded from the list of major characteristics of Alfred Lord Tennyson poetry. That's all. Thank you.